Did you know you can grow your email list as a podcast guest? Instead of borrowing someone else's audience, why not focus on growing your own? Take your listeners from curious to connected with a private podcast reader magnet. Want to try one out? Mine is called Listeners to Readers, and in just 6 short episodes, you'll learn how a private podcast can grow your email list and market your book. Grab it for free at listenerstoreaders.com. Do you find yourself wondering how to get more people to listen to your show and how to promote it in ways that don't feel yucky? Then I've got good news for you today. Guesting on other people's podcast is the best way to grow your own show. Seriously, podcast listeners love discovering new shows to listen to. And where they love discovering them is inside the app where they're already tuned in to their favorite shows. Forget about battling the social algorithms in hopes that your target readers will see your podcast promotion and then take their time to go off of the social platform to go listen to your show right then. Probably not going to happen these days. But when you make it so easy peasy during your interview on somebody else's show to take action, to follow and listen to your podcast in the app they're already hanging out in, boom, it's a no-brainer for listeners. I know this is true because I do it every day. I love listening to podcasts. Big surprise, I know. When I'm listening to my favorite podcast and they have a guest on the show and I hear that they mention, they have a podcast of their own, oh my gosh, I immediately pause the episode. I go find the guest show and follow it. And I might even check out their most recent episodes and save those to listen to later instead of waiting for it to pop up in my player again. Then I go back and I finish their guest episode. I love having these shows queued up for when I walk the dog, do the dishes, drive to pick up my son, hit the elliptical, etc. So, throughout your guest episode, it gives listeners like me a chance to connect with not only my favorite host that I listen to week in and week out, but also their guest, which is you, in my ears. As you start relating to listener struggles that they're facing and you're sharing encouragement and tips to overcome those struggles, you're hooking those listeners in, right, as a guest. Then I feel like I get to know you. You're my friend now, and I automatically associate your voice with the solution to the struggles that I have. And when the episode is over, all I want is more from you, right? And same for your listeners. But where do they find more? On your podcast, of course. So now, we're listeners of your show and we get to hear your voice encouraging us on an ongoing basis. And of course, you get to share your book with your listeners anytime you want because it's your show. Now, are you with me? Do you agree that guesting is the best way for you to grow your own podcast? Are you ready to get started? Well, tap the brakes for just a second because before you start pitching yourself to guest on podcasts to grow your own show, here's 3 things I want you to think about first. These tips came out of a coaching session with a client of mine on her podcast guesting strategy. And she'd been a guest on a few shows that had aired, and she asked, why is this strategy not working to grow her own show? She was seeing no results from guesting on other podcasts. So we dug into what she was doing, and I want to share similar action steps I gave her to ensure that you also see success with the time investment you make into guesting on other people's shows. So number 1, make sure you're consistent with your own show first. In episode 60, I talked about having a consistent online presence, and that includes your podcast. Because when a host receives your pitch to be a guest, they will go check you out. And if you're a fellow podcast host, guess where they're probably going to go looking first? Yep, your podcast. And if you're not showing up consistently to serve your own listeners, then why in the world would they think you're going to show up to serve as a guest on theirs? So as a podcast host, be consistent with your own show first. So what does this consistency look like? Well, it might be different for every show. Are you releasing episodes weekly, monthly, or seasonally? It doesn't matter which format you go with, just be consistent and make it obvious to listeners and host when they can expect the next episode. If you're like, well, we were on a break, that's okay. I do that often too. Just publish a quick episode that clearly shows in the title that you're on a break and when you'll be back, if you know when. I actually recommend to my podcasting clients that they record a break episode from the very beginning because, as we all know, life happens. You don't have to tell the why behind your break. You just have to let listeners know that the show's going on a break from releasing new episodes, and then upload it to your podcast hosting platform and have it ready in your drafts for when you need to schedule it. So, number one, before pitching to guest on podcasts to grow your own show, make sure you're consistent with your own listeners first. Then, number two, if you host an interview-only show, then consider sprinkling in a few solo episodes. Why do you want to do that? Because listeners can continue to get to know you and continue the conversation that was started on the podcast you guested on. As I mentioned, listeners feel connected to you after hearing you as a guest. They heard about your own podcast. They pop over to learn more from you there. And then if all they see are guest episodes where you're talking about someone else's book and possibly someone else's podcast too, well, womp, womp. That's what happened to my client. The listeners were engaged with her as a guest, but then when they went to connect further on her podcast, they scroll and scroll looking for an episode that's from her specifically, right? But all they see are guest episodes that have nothing to do with the topic that she shared as a guest on a podcast. So if your goal of hosting a podcast is to get your target readers to connect with you, especially as an author, then they need to hear your voice more than they do your guest. They need to hear the message of your book more than they do your guest book. And most important, they need to hear a similar message of what you shared as a guest on the episode they just heard. Now, if you're a solo show only, hopefully you've already got this covered and the topic of your show is in alignment with the topics you share when you guest on other people's shows. So, air a few solo episodes. They can be short and sweet. They could even be bonus episodes if you're trying to fit them in, but serve up some solo content for new listeners to discover after they've heard you as a guest and they come over to check out your show. Okay, so before pitching to guests on podcasts to grow your own show, number one, you're going to make sure you're consistent with your own listeners first. Number two, you're going to air a few solo shows if you're an interview-only show. Then, number three, another idea is you could air a roundup episode highlighting your most popular past episodes and tie those into the topic that you have been sharing as a guest. If you're a solo show, a roundup gives you a chance to also highlight some past shows that have resonated with your listeners. So maybe the same topic is really resonating, and especially if that same topic is the topic of your newest book. And you can also highlight your interviews with your guests too in that roundup, but have a roundup episode so you can kind of feed them exactly what they're looking for in one fell swoop. But I want to pause here just a second because we always want to keep in mind our goal for podcast guesting. Right now, we're talking about the goal of growing your own podcast by being a guest on others. So again, if you're an author and wanting target readers to connect with you and learn more about your book on your podcast, your topics are going to be in alignment with that. However, I know some of you may not have a book yet and you're podcasting to build your author platform. And you're having guests on your podcast to build relationships with more peers who are serving your target readers. In that case, you may be truly focusing on growing your show, period, to grow your platform. And it doesn't have anything to do with a book yet. In that case, I really want you to think about the topic you're sharing as a guest. If you're going to lead listeners back to your show and then serve up a roundup of popular episodes, then have that align with what you talk about on podcast. Your podcast likely has a specific niche to it and a specific problem you're solving. And you could create a guest podcast topic around that and even talk about the amazing conversations you've had on your own show with your guest. So back to the roundup. Let's say your speaking topics on other people's shows are encouragement for moms. Well, you could do a roundup of past episodes with your guest on your own show, but pull out, things that encourage moms and give your own spin on it related to what you talked about on another person's podcast that relates back to your own book or your own podcast. So, you could go broad. Like another one of my clients is a confidence coach. So she could round up past episodes on her own podcast of guests who have talked about other topics like parenting, marriage, entrepreneurship, living out your faith. She could have guests on her own show that talk about those topics, but she could roll it up under the umbrella of confidence, right? Because that's really what her show is about. And that's what she talks about on other people's podcasts. But her guest may not come in with that specific, thread through their topic, but she could round it up and make it into an episode herself. So think about that. A supernatural roundup episode would be to talk about confidence and then relate it to some of the takeaways from her most popular episodes. Does that make sense? So airing a roundup episode saves your listeners the trouble of digging through your catalog to find the gems they're looking for. You can serve them up right away. There's some instant gratification built in there as they hear you summarizing the kind of content they can expect on your show, and they'll want to follow it so they don't miss an episode. Okay, so before pitching to guest on podcast to grow your own show, number 1, make sure you're consistent with your own listeners first. Number 2, air a few solo shows if you're an interview-only show. And then number 3, you could air a roundup episode highlighting your most popular past episodes and tie those into the topic that you've been sharing as a guest, which is probably the topic of your show or the topic of your book. Okay, so now you have 3 things to think about before you start guesting on other people's shows to grow your own. And just in case you're like, wait, what I really want to do is guest on other people's podcasts to grow my email list, then be sure to listen to episode 174, where I shared that a private podcast reader magnet is my favorite way to grow your email list as a podcast guest. I'll be sure and put a link to it below in the show notes. So I hope you're as excited as I am about the potential of how you can grow your own show or even your email list by guesting on other people's podcasts. Thanks for tuning in today to Book Marketing Mania. And as always, I'll be there for you next episode to help you reach and serve your readers one podcast at a time. See you then.